She said she was death herself. Her calm confidence didn't waver for even a second as she said it, nor in the awkward silence that followed. Normally I would call bullshit, easily, but something about her made me doubt my own mind. Then again, maybe I was just a sucker for her striking beauty and did not have anything to lose either way. Yay for desperation. I had felt emotionless for weeks now. Still, to claim yourself a mythical presence is quite a ballsy move. I stared at her quietly, already regretting allowing her to join my table, as she let out a chuckle. You're free to walk away now, love, if that's what you'd like. You're not going to die today either way. She spoke lightly. But if you do decide to stay, know that most always regret it. I do enjoy the company though. For a second, I had considered doing so. I mean, she must have been batshit crazy, right? But I stayed put. God knows why. In a way, she reminded me of a story I read on a forum once about someone who decided to die as death. A beautiful young woman was waiting for him. Idiot! She laughed. But thank you for staying. She took a sip of her coffee and we chatted for a while, though she remained just as mysterious and charming as when she sat down. The socially awkward fool that I am, I just tried to make it through the conversation, at the same time trying to figure out if she truly was who she said she was, until she glanced at her watch for the 4th time since we met. Let's go then, but please just quietly observe. With a certain elegance she stood up, only taking her jacket. I still was none the wiser about her. Where are we go? Quiet, she replied again, both firm and with a smile. So I did just that, to intrigue not to. We had been walking for a few minutes in complete silence until she stopped at one of the higher buildings in the city. What? I stopped myself, remembering her words, and simply followed her with my eyes as she looked up. I did the same, but saw nothing but building disappearing into the fog at some point. Luckily they have an elevator, she muttered absent-mindedly and walked inside, with me still following her like a lost puppy, probably having too much faith in her telling me I'm not dying today. As we made it to the roof, I immediately realized why we were here. Seeing the man sitting on the edge, how could she possibly have known if she wasn't, in fact, death herself? It was impossible to see him from down below. Not going to lie, I panicked completely, though I understood his sentiment all too well, and froze. Should I call? I barely could squeeze out the words. She shook her head, composed as ever. Don't. Please, this is difficult enough as it is, she pleaded calmly and took hold of my hand, taking me to the side, further away from him. Look away if you need to, but don't interfere. I swallowed away the sour taste in my mouth and nodded. As I saw a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes, it didn't seem wise to go against her either way. I'll be right back. I just need to go have a chat with Paul over there. Then she walked towards him. I wish I could hear them speak. I could swear he recognized her. In between the emotions of defeat and fear, he seemed panicked, and I thought perhaps it was a good sign. Perhaps it meant he didn't want to die. From what I had read, the ones who are sure have no more fight left in them. It even seemed like he was about to come down the safe way. But then, in the blink of an eye, she pushed him. I had been in the police station for hours before they finally spoke to me. Apparently an older woman living in the apartment block across from ours had seen the man being pushed, though not by whom. Since I was the only one left on the roof after she simply walked away, they were quick to assume I was involved. When they asked what happened, I told them the truth. Every little detail apart from one. I assumed they might think I'm mental myself, talking about the Grim Reaper being a 20-something woman and all. I never was a good liar though, so I wasn't even going to try. Maybe them believing I'm an insane person was better than being a murderer. but I still hoped for the best. I was ready for them to get mad. They didn't. They just looked each other in the eye before once again turning to me, the older one's eyes full of pity, the younger one's frustrated. They waited for me to finish, to then slide a sketch in front of me of her. "Is this the woman you described?" My heart skipped a beat. The sketch was of bad quality and not entirely accurate, but it was obvious. Yes, that's her. I don't understand." The older one of the two men in front of me sighed. "What I'm going to tell you may be upsetting, Miss Dabria," he started. "This isn't the first time that this has happened. Anything they said after that is more like a vague memory. I threw up the first time when they told me she scoured a depression support forum looking for people on the edge of succumbing to mental illness, starting a conversation with them where she would convince them to choose for the end, even when and where. When they refused, she'd resort to other ways, blackmail, manipulation, and so on. And lastly, simple murder. I threw up the second time when I realized I watched a man get killed and I did nothing to stop it. I almost did a third time, after which they let me leave. When they kept asking me the same questions, knowing I couldn't give them any more information simply because I didn't know anything, except for one little detail that I had kept just for me. The last words she spoke to me before she left the scene: "See you tomorrow, love." It started when I was a baby, and it's been with me for as long as I can remember. The last couple of years I've been trying to free myself from it. However, it's not that easy. It always comes for you. It always haunts your mind. It doesn't just have me, it has millions of others. Some even join it willingly, doing its deeds in the name of good. However, they are also monsters, no better than the entity itself. I suppose I should back up. I didn't really know exactly what this thing was until recently. I was kind of blind to what it's done to me, the way it fundamentally changed who I am. It's made me a worse person without me knowing. It got in my head, and it's like it caused my brain to rot. Not enough to cause any actual damage. No. If I got my brain scanned, the doctors would find nothing abnormal. Yet I know it's in there, causing damage and wreaking havoc on my mind. As an adult, I can see what it's done. From when I was a small child, the entity appeared as kind. I was educated by it, taught in the ways by those whom it has deceived. You see, this entity has the teacher's minds like it has mine. Yet they're enthralled by it and think it can do no wrong. They want to serve it and to dedicate their life to it. It promises so much to those who are loyal to it. Its ways, they even praise it, thinking the entity is the truth and has all the answers. These things are what they tried to teach me as a child. I lived it, breathed it. I had a childlike wonder for it. The entity was even better than Santa Claus. Ironically, while I never believed in Santa, as my parents wouldn't allow for something so silly, I believed in the almighty good of the entity. The entity and its followers did trick me for a while. I mean, how could they not trick a child when that's all you know as a child? They were kind, benevolent, and promised me the world. They promised me a solution to all my problems. I fell for it for a while. The entity is fantastic at deception and manipulation. It made me think I had something very few others had, apart from those whose minds had also been taken over. Yet, when I began to look closely, I saw how dangerous the entity's minions are. Sometimes the entity's followers go completely insane and commit unspeakable acts. In some of the victims, the entity seems to almost take a sick pleasure in seeing how far off the deep end it can make some of its people go. It doesn't seem to have any reason for this. It just occasionally enjoys sick cruelty. I personally have witnessed the entity drive people insane. They say things they otherwise would not say, and they believe what it tells them unquestioningly, because they believe it's always right and it can do no wrong. Everything the entity would have them do is for the greater good, rather than for the power it has by controlling their minds. And even when the followers aren't committing criminal acts or believing in everything the entity says, they're still causing damage in others. It's small damage, but it adds up over time. Worst of all, they think they're helping you. And as I grew up, it got worse. The entity and its minions started to restrict my life and the freedom that other teenage kids got. These years are when some of its tentacles in my mind started to spread even deeper. It started to restrict what I did with my time, who I saw, in every little aspect of my life. Everything was to satisfy the hold which it had on my brain. I saw the lives of teenagers unaffected by the entity and thought they were lost, that maybe the entity could save them. Now that I'm older, I see the true damage it did, and I desperately wonder if I can ever get any of that back. It robbed me of so much. As an adult, the entity continued to have a hold of me. I continued to think it was all good, and it had my best interest in mind. I continued to believe it had something for me that no one outside of it ever would. Then, the doubt started to seep in. I got really anxious about turning against the entity. What if it turned away from me? What if all the good things it had built up for me were stripped away? But then, I started to explore and saw the true freedom that other people had. Chopping away at the tendrils and rot the entity had in my mind was like taking a butter knife to Jack's beanstalk. Yet I worked. I drove myself crazy wondering what the truth is. I pushed forward, not even knowing where I was going. And then it happened. It was like scales fell from my eyes. I can still feel the entity there and lurking. I can still feel the damage it did. Severe damage it is. But for the first time, I'm free. I can almost see the rot starting to fade as healthy flesh slowly begins to grow where dark misty tendrils once were. I'm free, but not so easily. I still feel it beckoning me. I know it's going to send its messengers to convince me of the greater treasure it has. I can hear its music, which sounds like bells and organs, and its leaders wearing pure white gowns. They're coming for me, thinking they're saving me, when in reality, they just want to push my head back under the ocean and let the entity feed again. I must be able to resist it. I must run for the freedom and never look back. I've worked so hard. It can't suck me back in now. Even as I feel a long tendril on my shoulder as I write this, trying to get me back in. I must resist, chop it off, stay strong, and live my freedom. There's something in the waters near our ancestral home, but no one believes me. Back when I was 11, my dad got a letter stating that we inherited a plot of land containing an antique home from the 1700s near a small river. It had recently belonged to my great uncle, who had neither a spouse nor children. I hadn't heard of the man before, but my father told me that near the end of his life, he had become completely isolated, so much so that he didn't even attend my grandpa's funeral. His brothers. All the old man would do was stand outside all day, staring at the shallow water of the river, as if he was looking for something. But not too long ago, he had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Some say he drowned, seeing how he spent a majority of his time near the river. But search parties never found a corpse, not near the house nor down the stream. And thus, after weeks of searching, he was proclaimed dead by the authorities. The official story states he wandered off in the state of confusion and likely died somewhere in the wild of hypothermia or starvation. But the real truth is that no one cared. We didn't even know when exactly he disappeared to begin with. It could have been hours, it could have been weeks, It could have been years. In fact, if it wasn't for the inheritance note, we might not have known at all. That month, my father decided we'd go and check out the house to see what we could do with it. We drove for hours, past the safe and secure confines of our home city, through the dark neighboring forest. There weren't any modern roads leading to the house, so we unexpectedly had to make a big part of the journey on foot, following an unlit, overgrown dirt road. I remember it vividly, the big trees looming over us in the dark, their branches and leaves weeping with the wind, warning us of the dangers ahead. Along the road there was sawgrass and reeds so high you could get lost in them. Somewhere, even though we were still far removed from the river, I swore I heard a burbling of water, ever so gently, leading the way. Deep in the night, we finally arrived at the house. It was barely visible, decrepit and overgrown. The grass that had, once upon a time, been faithfully warded off by the former inhabitants had completely overtaken the area, growing long enough to touch my shoulders. While my parents had looked at the house, me and my older brother explored the area a bit, when suddenly we found ourselves at the edge of the river. It was at least 10 steps wide from shore to shore and flowed at a steady pace. Yet, unlike earlier, it was completely silent. The both of us could have swore we saw the water move, yet in terms of sound, the river might as well not have been there. Furthermore, when I looked into the river, I couldn't see the bottom. I remember my dad saying it was extremely shallow, yet it felt like looking into a mirror. The surface of the water was so reflective, I could make out even the most minuscule detail on me and my brother's faces. I could see the full moon in all its splendor. I could even count individual stars. Yet when I looked up, the stars were barely visible, and the moon was small and barely noticeable. That's when my brother said it. "There's something in the water." As he stepped forward and his feet touched the river, ripples spread across the surface, yet it didn't make a sound. A feeling of panic took over me as the images were distorted by my brother's disturbance. As if by instinct, my legs gave out and I fell to my knees. My eyes frantically tried to puzzle together now the fragment reflection, almost desperate to behold them again. My head lowered more and more until my nose almost touched the surface of the river, as if pulled closer by some invisible force. A bit further in the water, I saw the reflection of my brother, now standing in the middle of the river, his own eyes looking back up at him. His feet were barely submerged, so we knew that there couldn't be anything hiding under the water. Yet the longer we were staring at the beautiful mirage, the more it seemed like something was there. Something that was hidden behind the intriguing reflection and spying at us. All we had to do was see past the surface of the water. My brother kept muttering, "It's watching us from the waters. There's something in the water, but I can't see it." Before he knew it, he lowered his head, lured in by the promise of discovering what was underneath the surface of the water. At that point, he was already kneeling in the stream, but he was not wet in the slightest, nor was there a trace of mud on his pants. Then, at last, his head disappeared past the reflection barrier, submerged past his neck, deeper than shallow water would ever allow. That was when I felt the urge to submerge my head in the water as well, to see for myself what was there. Past the glimmering reflection, at the bottom of the beautiful river. Who is waiting there for me? Who is watching me? I had to know. Both wonder and fear overwhelmed my heart as I readied myself to plunge down there. But before I could do so, I was awoken from the trance by my mother pulling me to her side. When I came to my senses, I saw my father dash through the river, calling out my brother's name. They asked me where he had gone, that they had been looking for us for hours. I was confused. I turned my head to where my brother had stood in the river. He wasn't there anymore. And when I looked down at the river again, I saw only myself staring back at me. We left the area the same night. My brother was never seen again, and it was assumed he wandered off into the wild and died there of hypothermia or starvation. But I knew better. I even warned them. Something was watching us from the depths of the shallow river. Something was in the water and it took my brother. But no one believed me. There was no body for the casket, only a picture, staring at us from behind the protective glass of the photo frame, like a prison keeping his image sealed away forever. During the funeral, I almost felt like he was watching me from underneath the surface of the photo, his piercing gaze luring me away from my seat. Even when they buried him, I couldn't help but shake the feeling he was watching me. At one point, I even felt the sudden urge to see what was behind the glass of the picture frame, past the photo. After all, a photo is nothing but a reflection frozen in time, and I craved its secret. For years it plagued my mind. Every window I passed, every river I crossed, and every mirror I looked into. All I wanted to know was what lay past their reflection. During the day and at night, my mind was plagued by the same question. What was there looking back at me? But I can't handle it anymore. The pill stopped working, and everyone else had moved on. Not me. I have to see what's there. I can't go another restless night awake in fear, lying in my own sweat. Tonight, I will return to the river, and I will find out the truth there. To whoever reads this, I suggest you do the same, because you can only be sure something's there when you've seen it, and only then will you be able to be at peace. Something is watching us from the waters. I swear it. Why on earth would anyone want to sit out there on that cold ice all day just to catch a bluegill? My dad used to always say. To be fair, I agreed with him for a long time. We would posture with each other about how we just didn't like being cold just to catch a puny fish. But in reality, our macho-headedness wouldn't allow us to admit that we were actually afraid. My dad had good reason. His best friend's father fell through the ice one time and damn near ripped his fingernails off just trying to get back up to safety. As a kid, anything that scares your dad, your 6-foot-plus broad-shouldered invincible dad, will also scare you. Fast forward to today, and I can't stay off the ice. It started with a friend asking me to go fishing with him. As a 27-year-old man from the country, there is no way I could admit fear. In fact, I met this friend in the weight room. I couldn't let my trepidation of falling through the ice shatter the tough guy facade of a muscle-bound gym bro. It turned out to be a great time. The anticipation of a fish swimming right below your feet, under the solid barrier of ice and inhaling your lure or bait, was the perfect excuse to get out of the house when things are at their most dull during the winter. As with all outdoor activities, there's always a certain indescribable mystique that surrounds you when you're on the ice. Sitting in the middle of a barren snow-blown lake allows you to be very aware of the harsh surroundings. I had a rule for a long time to only go ice fishing if I had a partner. The dangers abound, falling through the ice, flash blizzards, wrecking on the unkept back roads, etc. As life goes, friends got busy, and I started going solo against my better judgment. I couldn't tell you why I decided to go to the lake I did that day. Every other lake in the county would have had at least one other angler to give me some semblance of safety. I guess I just wanted to be alone. I pulled into the parking lot knowing it would be empty and gathered all my equipment in the sled. I trekked out to a familiar weed line and drilled a few holes. Hours ticked by, but not a single bite. I listened to the wind howling over the ridgetop as it passed through the massive windmills that were cool to me as a kid. But now, we're simply an eyesore on every mountain. The lake was in a valley, and the mountains reached to the sky in every direction, almost like standing in a sports stadium. As the day went on, the temperature dropped slowly, and the wind brought in light flurries that turned to steady snow. I switched to a lure that I could work with some vigor, just to try to keep my hands warm as my fingertips were now starting to sting as the cold worked its way through my winter gloves. I was so supremely focused on the action I was imparting on my lure that I never saw him walk out on the ice. I was reaching for my thermos to take a swig of hot coffee. I noticed him standing on the opposite side of the lake. It wasn't an altogether odd occurrence that he made it on the ice without me noticing. I was, after all, pretty deep in thought and focus. The first thing that struck me about him was how he just stared at me. It was almost like I could feel him looking into my eyes, even though he was a quarter mile away. I shook my head and wondered why it bothered me so much. I often stared at other people when out fishing too, mostly to see if they were catching anything, but also just because boredom sets in incredibly fast if you're not having any action. I was more than likely already on edge because of my continued fear of falling through the ice anyways. I went back to focusing on my fish sonar and waited for a bite. The wind blew harder, and to counter the uncomfortableness, I reached in my sled for the best part of the trip. I pulled out one of those Little Debbie Christmas tree cakes and began to unwrap it. I waited all year for those sweet diet bombs to come out and hoard them once they do. As I sat, munching on my cake, I looked around at the increasing volume of snow falling from the sky. That's when I realized he had moved, not only closer to me, but also closer to the woods line, almost like he was trying to get behind me. Although the sun was low and the overcast sky made it seem an hour later than it really was, I could still see him staring directly at me. His silhouette was getting lost in the darkness of the woods, but I could make out that he was a thinner man with a slight hunch. Any misgivings I had of comfort were now shattered. I immediately started packing up. I wasn't trying to rush, as I knew he was looking my way. I didn't want things to escalate any higher. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him on a full-out sprint over the ice. I said to hell with my gear and started running myself. You move very slow on the ice, much like in a daydream, especially when you're weighted down with the full snowsuit on. I was full-blown panicking at this point and wishing I was a bit more like every other redneck in my town and carrying a pistol. Unfortunately, mine was safely in a lockbox at home. I had my eyes peeled on my truck in the parking lot and realized there wasn't any other car there. This meant that he must have been from one of the 3 or 4 cabins that were up on the mountainside tucked in the woods. I didn't know if he wasn't happy that I was on his lake, or if he was just a nut. Either way, I had to look back and see how close he was. He was gaining, and fast, because he was only in a flannel and jeans. Although he had to have been freezing, he was also less weighted down and was moving much more agile than I. As my feet left the ice and hit the ramp, I could now hear his breathing behind me, off in the distance. He was close, but I felt comfortable enough that I would make it to the truck in time. Just as I slammed the door and threw it in reverse, he full body checked my passenger side door. Both his hands slapped at my window as he screamed at me as if in a manic episode. His eyes did not change from the same cold stare. I completely froze for a moment, looking directly at him. I quickly snapped back and peeled out of the lot. The roads were now snow-covered, and I fishtailed a bit, but ultimately was out of harm's way as he faded into my side view mirror. I slowed down as to not wreck, and was able to gather my thoughts a bit. It was then I realized what he was screaming at me during our close encounter. "You have to leave before dark. It comes out at dark. You're not safe. You're not safe. You're not safe." There is plenty of undiagnosed mental health cases in Appalachia. The people are remote, and healthcare, especially mental health care, isn't always readily available. There is also a deep history of supernatural happenings and beings in the mountains. I've been going back and forth all night, trying to figure out if that man was an unfortunate victim of mental health crisis, or a concerned local who was trying to protect me. I'm not sure where I land at the moment, but I have to say, my curiosity is getting the better of me. I've been friends with Jacob for 3 years now. We met right after the turning point of puberty, that awkward spike where hair sprouts from every comprehensible nook and cranny on your body, and testosterone drags you forward like a carrot on a stick. I was vulnerable, having lost my mother the year Jacob and I had met. I was attracted to his disposition, what a soft person he is. His facial features are soft too. His lips fade into his face with subtle tones, and his eyes curve down at the sides, displaying a feminine charge. I always maintained a keen eye for him. My friend Kat didn't like him at first glance. She was brought up in a crowded family by her housewife mother and pastor father, and her religious side unveiled itself when it helped her most. I think she was jealous of my blossoming friendship with Jacob. She used to hiss at me the words, "Satan himself transforms into an angel of light," through her woolen sleeve whenever he smiled at me. I've never been particularly religious. One night, when Jacob was sleeping over at my house, after a rowdy night of boisterous conversation and a potato chip dinner, he made it clear he wanted to go to bed. He lay on the blown-up mattress beside my bed. "Are you afraid of death?" he whispered into the cold night between us. "Not really," I responded bluntly, as you do to meaningless dialogue during a teenage sleepover. "I know what happens. Tell me." "You'll wake up in a new life, just like you did when you were born, and just like you did the last time you were born." I have always considered the prospect of reincarnation, as I still can't entirely comprehend the concept of consciousness. The existence of life is even mind-boggling to me, but I don't believe in it. "Oh yeah? How do you know?" I sneered. "Because I remember all the lives I lived, and I've lived some terrible lives. I have lived through poverty, torture, endless torture and poverty, cancer, all of it. And I'm sick of it. I want to get out of it. Every time I die, I come back as every person who ever lived." He croaked with wet eyes. His sincerity is baffling. I'm a little spooked. This whole conversation is so sudden, and right after us having such a good time and laughing, I'm starting to think something's wrong with him. And the worst part, I can't even remember the beginning. It has just been death, amnesia, coming back as another person, and now all of a sudden, in this life, I remember all of it. He said with a nasal chuckle, "I have lived as everyone, even Kat. I know all the secrets you've told her. Are you alright, man? You're scaring me." I winced. "Is your pet goldfish alright? I think his name was Randy." I didn't tell him that. That's such a simple thing for you to know. She probably told you that. That's the biggest secret you've told her. I also lived the life of your mom. She died on your birthday, right? And that she died of a heart attack, and that your last words to her were, "Thank you for breakfast." Those were my last words to her. I was thanking her for the syrup pancake she made me on that morning of my birthday. She makes it better than anyone else. She made it better than anyone else. I burst into tears. "Do you want to live the life of everyone else?" he asked with a soothing tone. "No, I don't," I whispered in a small moment that I stifled the flow of my relentless tears. I hadn't cried about my mom's death until then. I think I wasn't ready before this. This is what we have to do. We have to intercept the process. If we are both aware of our past lives, we will unite and it will all end. We will descend and return to the earth beneath us, he said mystically. I agreed, and he sat me down in front of him. He looked into my eyes, held my temples between his two palms, and kept looking. I had a feeling it was working because my vision was going black. I thought I would have thrown up, but I didn't. I consumed a near infinite amount of memories and lives at that moment, and the little lives that I lived began to light up like a light bulb amidst a vast wall of memory. I remember all the mothers I've had, and all the children I've had. I remember the life of Kat, and how she cut off all her friends after she graduated, and how she killed herself after college. I remember how it felt being stabbed and shot and burned alive many times over. I remember how it felt to starve in a little village, and how to stuff my face full of delicacies offered in some place in Bulgaria felt. In a way, it was liberating. Jacob and I continued to look each other in the eyes. We acknowledged the information we were faced with, and our heels sink into the carpet beneath us. "It's working," he uttered. "What will happen?" I asked. "We'll find out tomorrow. I need to sleep over at yours tomorrow, so we'll descend together." The next day at school was a migraine. I looked at everyone in the halls and visualized the life I lived as them. I was not able to recall all memories of myself in my current body from the perspective of another person, even Kat. As Kat, I could remember all the memories she made with family and friends, but not me, and I'm her best friend. "Are you okay?" Kat asked me. My ankles are submerged in the ground at this point. "I'm fine," I spoke dismissively. At lunch break, the ground was up to my knees. Jacob was also in the ground as far as me, but nobody seemed to notice us being literally in the ground. When I got home, Jacob came with me. The ground was up to our groins now. The house was stark and bleak in a haunting way. It was like the sky went gray and was leaking in through the windows and removing any joy that the house created. I almost felt like I was diving into the past. The seat my mother always sat in had a dent in it, her dent. I could visualize her silhouette lounging there. My father came home before sunset. He called out to me, and I responded tersely. The ground was up to our torso now. Jacob and I sat in silence until night. We were recalling the lives we lived, and the wisps of joy we felt in each one, and the gargantuan volume of sorrow we felt. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came back, I couldn't move. The hollow shell of the house was harrowing, and I felt so distressed and in agony to be in my body. I wanted to end the cycle. I was standing next to my bed and in front of my bedroom door. Only my head was out of the ground. My bed is elevated with nothing underneath it. I liked it that way because I was always able to crawl underneath it when I desired a feeling of coziness. The room was dark, and my eyes were yet to adjust, but I could see a figure laying beside Jacob's blown-up mattress, visible from under the bed. I squinted at it to get a sense of what it was, but my eyes couldn't pick it up. I don't know where Jacob is right now. I called out to him a few times, but all that responds is the echo of my presence, almost non-existent. I can see what the figure is now. I had a feeling it would be this, but I hope not. Otherwise, my journey with Jacob would have been for nothing. But it is. It's my corpse, staring at me with glassy eyes and a drooping mouth. My skin looks purple and sheen by the faint glow of blue light dripping in from the tightly closed shutters. A dark substance runs down my corpse face from its temples. I turn to the door, and Jacob stands before me. He is above ground, his feet digging into the carpet. He looks down at me. His smile is warped, and his eyes are blank. They look uncannily human. The shadows on his face obscure any other conceivable details. I feel myself sinking. "Maybe Kat was right," he said silently. I hear nothing but his voice. Satan himself transforms into an angel of light. No God could save me now. I'm guessing you don't want to hear about my everyday life, so I will just write down the interesting and relevant parts. 3 days ago, I woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like heavy breathing coming from the doorway of my bedroom. Frightened, I opened my eyes and looked to where I had heard the noise, and I saw what appeared to be a woman. It was too dark for me to get any details of her appearance, other than her height and long dark hair. But I could feel her staring straight into my soul. My heart was pounding, and I tried to move, but I couldn't. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't. So I did the only thing I could. I stared at her, terrified with an overwhelming feeling of powerlessness. After a few seconds, which felt like hours, she just disappeared. There was no movement, no sound. One moment she was there, and the next she wasn't. After she disappeared, I discovered that I could move again, but I didn't move. I just continued staring at where she had stood for a few minutes. I was terrified, but I managed to find enough courage to get out of bed and turn on the lights. My first thought was to search through the house and to call the police because of someone breaking in and watching me sleep. But my second thought was that it wasn't a break-in, that it wasn't even real. Just a realistic and horrifying nightmare. How else would I explain being unable to move and the woman just disappearing? So I called a close friend of mine. He was annoyed at me calling and waking him up in the middle of the night. But I told him it was important and that he needed to come over, so he told me he needed a few minutes to get dressed and that he would be here as soon as possible. Still scared and waiting for my friend, I opened Google to find out if anyone had experienced something similar to what happened to me. And I found out something called sleep paralysis. If you don't know what it is, I'll give you a summary of what I found out from Wikipedia. It's basically your brain waking up before your body, so you find yourself unable to move, and when it happens, you may hallucinate. So while reading, I heard someone knocking on the door. I must admit that I was scared when I heard it, before remembering that I had asked someone to come over. So I walked downstairs, or rather, I ran downstairs scared of the dark and opened the door and invited my friend to come inside. He commented on me being a bit shaky and asked if I was alright and why I had asked him to come over. So I told him what had happened and that I was scared of being alone. To my surprise, he didn't ask for any follow-up questions, and he wasn't mad or even annoyed at me. He just offered to stay up with me until morning and to sleep with me for a day or two if it made me feel safer. I accepted his offer and asked myself what I had done to deserve such amazing friends. After chatting with him for a few minutes, we took a mattress and placed it next to my bed so we could sleep there for the following night. And after that, we went to the living room and watched TV until morning. Fast forward to 2 days ago, me and my friend had went to bed. He was laying next to me on the mattress we had placed on the floor the previous night, and once again, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing, but this time, it wasn't coming from the doorway. It was coming from the foot of my bed. As I opened my eyes, I saw the same woman from the night before. I tried to move, I tried to scream, I tried to alert my friend, but I couldn't. I looked into the eyes of the woman, and even though it was too dark to see any details, and even though the only thing I could see in the place where her eyes were supposed to be was darkness, I knew that she was staring back at me. Terrified, I didn't dare to break eye contact, but then I heard a scream filled with horror, not coming from the woman, but from my friend. The woman looked at the source of the noise, and then once again she disappeared into thin air, and I was able to move. As if we had practiced beforehand, both me and my friend jumped out of bed at the exact same time. And once I was up on my feet, I walked over to the light switch and turned on the lights. As soon as the lights were on, he asked me something along the lines of, "What the heck just happened?" So I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know. He wasn't happy with the answer he got, but it was the only one I had. After some crying from my part, and a lot of swearing coming from the both of us, we went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife for protection, and then once again, I found myself doing some Googling to find out what we had just encountered. After maybe 30 minutes, I found something interesting. I stumbled across something from some old folklore here in Sweden. It's called Mara. There was a lot of different information and stories about it, but something most of them had in common was that there was a woman sitting on your chest making you unable to move and sometimes even killing you. It had not sat on my chest, but it did catch my attention since it was part of Swedish folklore. And if it was Mara, there was a way to get rid of it. When researching it, I found a spell to banish it. The only problem was that I was unable to move, much less cast a spell on it. But I had a friend with me who could help me out. So I told my friend what to say if I were to get a visit the next night. We decided to keep the lights on, and that he should try to stay awake as long as possible, and to try the spell if we got another visit from the woman. Now, fast forward to what happened last night. Unlike the previous nights, I wasn't woken up by the sound of heavy breathing. I woke up to what felt like 100 kilos on my chest, and the awful smell of something rotten. I opened my eyes and saw the woman that had been tormenting me, her face centimeters from mine. And thanks to the light, I could now make out some details, and I really wish I couldn't. Her eyes were black as night, and her face was that of an old woman. Her skin was pale as death, and her long black hair was hanging down, and it looked like it had never been washed. The rotten smell I had felt was coming from her, and I heard a familiar sound of her heavy breathing. The feeling of pure terror was now overwhelming, and the woman's mouth opened, and with a raspy and low-pitched voice she whispered, "I'll kill you." My heart was racing, and I couldn't barely breathe due to the pressure on my chest. I have never, and I don't think I ever will be, as scared as I was then. She slowly raised and moved her hands towards my throat. They were bony, and her nails were long and dirty. As she placed her hands around my throat, I felt how cold they were, and then she started applying pressure. As she was choking me, I finally heard it, the voice of my friend. He screamed, "Mara, Mara memory, in the name of the Lord I banish thee, until you have counted all the birds in the sky, all the words of God, and all the fish in the sea. In the name of the Lord I banish thee." As soon as he was finished, the woman shrieked in pain and lunged at my friend, but before she could reach him, she disappeared. Now I'm writing this after drinking 7 cups of coffee. My chest still hurts, and I'm terrified of ever going to sleep. My friend is still with me, but I'm praying that she's gone. Every night she had been getting closer, and the last time she was on my chest and told me she would kill me. I have no doubt that if the spell didn't work, I won't wake up tomorrow. I'm an avid reader here at No Sleep. My favorite subgenre is the rules. You know the ones. Person moves into a house or starts a job and finds a list of rules on the first day. Person doesn't follow the rules for whatever reason, and stuff starts going sideways. I always thought I was better and smarter than the protagonist. I'm good at following rules, right? I could remember to not leave my room after a certain time, or to keep my eyes down when talking to the person in the brown pants, or whatever. I never really believed the stories here were real, despite the admonishment at the top of the subreddit. So I hope you can imagine my surprise when I walked into my new apartment and found a frame hanging on the wall by the door, which held a yellow piece of parchment with a fancy calligraphy heading which said, "The rules of the house." I have to be honest here and tell you that my first thought was, this isn't a house, idiot. Then I thought, no way, it can't be real, as I walked over to take a closer look. At first, I thought it must have been one of those cheesy posters families put up, with pop culture references or ways to treat each other. But as I walked up to it, I saw my mistake. It was a list of the rules. Here's what it said. Knock twice before walking through the bathroom door. This is doable, I thought. Always wash the dishes immediately after cooking or eating. Ugh. Okay, Mom. If you hear 3 knocks, don't open the door. I hope they knock loud. If you feel like you're being watched, don't look for the watcher. Shy guy. If you wake up in the night and hear breathing, cover your head with your blanket until morning. Seems like the kids were right all along. As you can see by my snarky first thoughts, I didn't think it was real at first. I knew I had read enough though, to take it seriously anyway. So, when I went to the bathroom to put things away, I knocked twice, then did the same on the way out. I washed the dishes when I finished dinner. I figured I would do things just in case. You know. Well, I was glad I had been cautious when I felt the tingle at the back of my neck, and I knew that someone was watching me. I remembered not to look at the watcher, so I kept my eyes glued on Twitter. I knocked again when I went in to brush my teeth, and I realized that this isn't the life I want to live. I know. It had only been one day, and the rules weren't all that bad. This is what I think the stories don't convey. It's a drag. Knocking twice before going into the bathroom. 2 times had been enough for me. What if I'm tired when I get home and don't want to wash the dishes? It's my home. I should be able to do what I want in it. So I stopped unpacking and texted the landlord to see if there was another open apartment in the complex. I got lucky and there was. So I begged the landlord to let me switch. He didn't seem surprised at all at my request, which made me assume that he knew about the rules and made me feel angry that he didn't warn me. But I got over that because I was so happy to switch places. Once the switch was made, I breathed a sigh of relief and got my new place all set up after I made sure there was no framed set of rules hanging up anywhere. I lived happily in my new place for a solid week. No knocking, washing the dishes when I wanted to, and sleeping soundly without being watched. You can imagine my surprise when I came home to find an envelope taped to my door and opened it to find a new set of rules. Leave the kitchen window open 1/4 of an inch all the time. Never look at the ceiling in the bathroom when the sun isn't out. When you hear the sound of bell tolling, spin around until the tolling stops. Never leave dishes in the sink. Always set an extra place at the table. Knock before you go through any door. I sat down hard on the floor, dropped the paper, and closed my eyes tightly, willing the paper to disappear and things to go back to normal. When I opened my eyes to verify that the paper did not, in fact, disappear, I took several deep breaths as I rushed to open the kitchen window and wash the dishes. I gave thanks that it was an efficiency apartment and there was no door between the living room and the kitchen. Then I walked into my bedroom, making sure to knock before entering, and collapsed onto my bed, weeping, because I was going to have to move again. I didn't think the landlord was going to take kindly to me requesting another move, so I sat up and really thought about it. Well, these rules aren't quite as creepy as the other ones, I thought to myself. No watcher or breather. That's good. Maybe I can do this. I can leave the window open and set an extra place and do the dishes. So I decided to stay for a while and look for a new place eventually when I couldn't take it anymore. Like I said, having to follow strange rules in your own home is a drag. After a week, I had mostly gotten used to the rules. They weren't quite second nature, but I followed them because I didn't want to find out what would happen if I didn't. I knocked, I washed. Actually, I mostly got takeout and ate in my car. I didn't look at the ceiling. I spun, and I kept a sweater in the kitchen because the wind gets cold. Under the drudgery of it, I started to feel cocky about it. Started to feel a little bit of superiority. Started to feel like I could comment on people's stories like, I could do it. Don't be a wuss. Then, I found an index card on my desk at work. At noon, hold your breath for 15 seconds. Tap your right knee anytime someone sneezes. End every email with 2 periods. If you see a shadow in the corner of your office, beg its forgiveness for interrupting it. I froze. I didn't know what was happening. I did know what was happening, but I couldn't believe it. Then I heard someone sneeze and tap my right knee. I decided to take a few days off from work to figure this out. I sent an email to my boss asking for a few days of PTO, citing an unexpected illness in the family. I almost forgot to end the email with 2 periods. Thank God I remembered at the last second before I hit send. My boss is great, so she responded almost immediately that I should take as much time as I needed. I packed up my things and forced myself to walk rather than run out to my car. I was feeling frantic now. I never read about anyone having 2 sets of rules at one time, and I certainly didn't trust myself to remember them all the time. I was thinking about how maybe I could just sleep in my car as I walked through the parking garage, and I stopped dead in my tracks when my car came into sight, with a white piece of paper tucked under the wiper blade on the driver's side of my car. For a single moment, I let myself believe that it could be a parking ticket or something. Then I took a deep breath and finished walking to the car. I felt tears spring into my eyes and start trailing down my cheeks as I read the writing on this paper. If you run a yellow light, kiss your index finger and touch it to the ceiling of the car. Never turn the music up past volume level 9. Never turn the same direction 2 times in a row. If the radio tells you to take a turn, obey it. Don't eat or drink in the car. Don't imagine you can escape. It took some doing, but I managed to get home following the rules. The most difficult rule to follow was not imagining escaping. The rules were following me, and it didn't seem like there was any safe place. I thought about going to my parents' house. I thought about selling my car and taking the bus forever. I thought about giving it all up and living in a box under the bridge. I thought about these things and dismissed them all because I couldn't really do any of them. I sat in my car for a few minutes when I reached my apartment complex, taking some deep breaths to steady myself, and worked up my courage to face the rules in my apartment. When I had gathered my courage, I walked up to my place and knocked on the door before going in, and then dropped my things and plopped down on the couch. I rubbed my eyes as I let my hair down and stretched. I was looking for the TV remote when I noticed a framed document hanging on my wall. It was a yellow piece of parchment. The heading at the top was written in calligraphy and said, "The rules of the house." The first item said, "Knock twice before walking through the bathroom door." I buried my head in my hands and wept. There really was no escape. All of that was several hours ago. I'm writing this on my table under my blankets as I listen to heavy breathing from the other side of my bedroom. I can't make it until sunrise, but I'm young, and life looks pretty bleak under the weight of the rules. It's been about a week since my last experience with the rules. I made index cards with the rules on them to carry in my wallet just in case. Even though I've gotten them memorized already, it's easier to remember things when you don't know what happens if you forget. You know. I've even been ending texts with 2 periods just in case. I keep thinking about a couple comments which suggested that I should ignore the rules and that maybe it was mental issue on my part, rather than something supernatural like in the stories. At first, I was offended that people would suggest either of those things. After a while though, I realized that they had a point. I did need to know whether or not this was really real. I looked at the rules and decided that the safest set to test out was probably the set in my home. After a little more thought, I decided to not set that extra place at dinner, so I cooked up some stir-fry and then sat down to eat, all by myself, with only my plate on the table. It was a little odd not to see that second setting, and by the time I was halfway done with my meal, the desire to get up and set the second place was almost uncontrollable. I fought through it and gulped down the last few bites as quickly as I could without choking, feeling proud that I won. I tidied up, did the dishes, and finished out my evening. I only had to spin once, which was a relief because the bell tolled 3 times the other night. I was just glad it tolled when I was in my living room and could collapse onto my couch because I was so dizzy that I could barely stand. I grabbed my phone, knocked, and headed into the bathroom to do my toiletry, making sure to keep my eyes on my phone the whole time since it was after dark, and then headed into my bedroom. I looked back into the kitchen as I knocked, just to make sure that everything was right, and the block was still under the window. Satisfied that I had followed every other rule, I climbed into bed and pulled out Reddit to read for a while until I fell asleep. I heard a noise right before I fell asleep and almost got up to check it until I realized that what I heard was 3 light knocks, so I stayed put. The next morning, I slept late because the breather had woken me up, and it's really hard to fall back to sleep with the blanket over my head and someone breathing in my room. I woke up and stretched before going over to the rules card that I kept in my room now. It was amazing how quickly glancing at them had become a morning routine, like brushing my teeth. I slid out of bed and went to the bathroom, knocking quietly on each door frame of course, and looked up at the ceiling just for fun, because I could. I was feeling happy and cheerful until I walked into the kitchen area and saw that the fruit in my fruit bowl was all rotten. I thought that it could be a coincidence, so I went to my refrigerator. When I opened the door, all my food was rotten. I stopped dead in my tracks and gasped as tears sprang to my eyes. It was real. It was all real. I'm so sorry, I choked out through my tears. I'll obey. I will. I hope that whomever put these rules in place believed in second chances. I stood in place as I took deep breaths and calmed myself down. I took a few minutes to collect myself and then pulled out my phone to take another piece of advice y'all gave me. I texted my landlord to see if he would stop by my place and literally pumped my fist when he texted back that he would be by at 3. I looked at the clock, did some math, and decided to use my day to find out more about my situation. I was scared, but I've seen enough movies to know that there might be a solution. I started by heading down to the cute little coffee shop down the block. It was within walking distance, but getting there took some extra time because I went ahead and made sure I didn't turn the same direction twice in a row. Better safe than sorry, right? When I got there, I got my coffee-flavored sugar milk and sat down to do some Googling. I wanted to see if there was anything strange in the history of my apartment complex. There wasn't. Next, I wanted to check and see if there was any information about the rules, which wasn't on Reddit. There wasn't. So, I finished my drink, packed up my stuff, and headed out to the library. This trip was a little easier since the way there was a straight shot, and I made sure to cross the street right in front of the library, so I only made one right turn. I knocked discreetly when I walked through the door and turned to go to the desk. Within seconds of my turn, I heard horns blaring, tires screeching, and someone yelling. I froze. I spun around and ran back to the door, making sure to knock as I ducked through it. 2 cars had collided, and it was my fault. It looked like no one was hurt, though both parties were going to need a lot of body work on their cars, which was good, but I had to be more careful from now on. Navigating through the library was stressful because I had to keep careful track of the turns I took as I looked through the supernatural and occult section, while watching the clock to make sure I didn't miss holding my breath. I was using my days out of the office to get into the habit of following the rules there as well. I pulled a few books, but there was nothing helpful in them. I went to the psychological section and pulled out the DSM and a few other books in which I thought I'd find information about OCD. None of them said anything about real consequences of breaking the compulsions, only that people imagine things going wrong as a result. So I realized that it really was happening. I didn't repeat my mistake on my way home, paying very close attention to my turns. It was a stroke of luck though, because I found myself distracted by cars passing with loud music or drivers with food in their hands. I couldn't help but wonder if bad things were going to happen to them, or if they were safe because they didn't know the rules. Maybe ignorance really was bliss. As I walked home, I found myself counting each turn. This way, I knew that if I was on an even number, I had to turn left, and an odd number meant a right turn. Happy to have solved at least one problem, I knocked on the door of my complex and headed into my apartment to wait for my landlord. I had planned to be sneaky about it and ask him if he could find a stud so I could hang a picture in the spot where the rules were hanging. But I decided to just ask outright since I knew it wasn't all in my head. I had just finished spinning when I heard 2 knocks on the door. I caught my breath and went to greet my landlord, who walked in with a smile. When he asked me if everything was okay, I asked him if anyone else had broken the rules. He tilted his head to the side and asked me what I was talking about. "You know, the rules of the house," I remember saying. "Has anyone ever broken them? And if so, what happened?" "Oh," he exclaimed, "I get it. If someone breaks the lease agreement, I give them a warning and then evict them if they continue to do the wrong thing. It's happened a time or 2. "No, not the lease. The rules." I was a little annoyed. "You know, don't look at the watcher and set a plate out every meal." I pointed to the framed list that held up the index cards. "Those rules." I must have been more agitated than I thought, because he took a step back and then held up his hands. Listen, I don't care what kind of rules you go by while you're living here, as long as your TV is turned down during quiet hours, and I don't have any property damage. Now, if you'll excuse me." With that, he ducked through my door and into the hallway, where he tripped and fell down the short set of stairs. I was stunned. He didn't know what I was talking about. He also fell after not knocking. I was completely convinced that it was real now, and that ignorance of the rules didn't excuse people from their consequences. I grabbed a pen and wrote, "Turn down the TV during quiet hours," and "no property damage" on the index card, just to be safe. Then I started thinking about the future. That night was a rough night for me. It felt like the rules were testing me after 2 failures during the day. The bell tolled, and while I was spinning, I felt myself being watched, so I had to close my eyes so I didn't look in the wrong place. It wasn't until I heard a loud boom of the TV exploding that I realized that the bell tolled for so long that it was past 9 by the time I finished spinning. I hadn't turned it down in time. Later, almost as soon as I got into bed, I heard breathing in the corner and had to cover my head for the whole night, which was the worst. I took a slow, deep breath and peeked out from under the corner of my blanket and immediately wished I hadn't. When I lifted the blanket, there was a grotesque face an inch from my eye. I barely had time to register its sunken eyes and pockmarked face before I pulled the blanket back down and scooted my body back against the wall to escape the tongue, which flicked out against the blanket. The next morning, I knew that I had to do something. All of the people in the world were breaking these rules and risking terrible things, and they didn't even know it. It was terrifying and tragic all at once. So I made copies of the rules. I typed them up and printed them out on clean white paper. There was no place to buy parchment anywhere near my place. I folded them up and put them in envelopes which I slipped under the door at each apartment in my complex. As I walked out to spread the word and keep people safe, I also added a rule: learn to love the rules.